Hey everybody, Matt from 90th percentile.ca here. For access to more study notes, practice questions, mock exams, and end of chapter question videos, visit 90th percentile.ca and sign up for your free trial today. Link below in the description. This learning module is aggregate output, prices, and economic growth. Here there's really main two topics. One is going to be some different formulas and calculations that we do related to GDP. Key two ones being calculating GDP using the expenditure approach. So it's a sum of consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. Then there's also one more equation that's somewhat similar to the GDP equation, but this is used to model the relationship between the government trade balance, or the fiscal deficit, in other words. And then this is private sector savings and investment. And then here, like we said, net exports. So these two equations are really important. This GDP one is pretty straightforward. Like you might be given a question with all these different inputs and you're asked to calculate GDP. This one's a little bit trickier where, we can get some questions where we might say, okay, an increase of the trade balance has to result in what implications for the private sector or what implications for net exports in order to make this equation equal. So remembering this equation is really important because there's, a lot of different variations of questions that can be asked based on this formula. And then in the second half, we're going to be talking about aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and long run aggregate supply. This is a chart that you'll get really familiar with, where we have aggregate demand being downward sloping, aggregate supply being upward sloping, and long run aggregate supply being vertical. And basically what we're going to talk about is how shifts in each of these curves, so this here would be a shift in the aggregate demand or aggregate supply curve, what that implies for output, which is on the y, this is the same as GDP, and prices. Throughout all of these questions, I find it really useful to be able to draw this graph and visualize how a shift in either of these curves impacts whatever you're looking for in the question. But we'll go over that with some examples, and we're going to explain what causes these shifts, what that means for equilibrium in the short run and the long run, and how that impacts the economy. So with that, let's get into the questions. Suppose a painting is produced and sold in 2018 for 5,000. The expenses involved in producing the painting amounted to 2,000. According to the sum of value added method of calculating GDP, the value added by the final step of creating the painting was 2,000, 3,000, 5,000. So the sum of value added basically just says that the incremental value added at each step, so whether it's through producing the good would be one step or selling the good would be another step, the incremental value is included in GDP. So in the final step of selling, it's actually going to be the difference between the 5,000 and the 2,000, which is 3,000. If, if the amount included in GDP was 5,000, it wouldn't really make sense, right? Because we're double counting the 2,000 that was used to originally produce it. So if this was the case, a country could just keep selling goods for like 2000, 2001, 2002, and every time it would, the amount included in GDP would include every prior value, so it would be double counting, triple counting the values, so we just have to include the incremental cost. From the beginning to ending years of a decade, the annual value of final goods and services for country X increased from 100 billion to 300 billion. During that period, the GDP deflator increased from 111 to 200. So this is used to account for inflation over the years. Over the decade, real GDP, so accounting for inflation, for country X increased by approximately what? So in order to compare these figures, we're going to need to standardize them versus the GDP deflator in that year. And remember, the GDP deflator is actually like a percentage. So when we do this, it would be 100 billion divided by 1.11, not 111. And this is 90, so 90 billion adjusted for inflation. This would be step one, step two, step one, and step two. We have 300 over 2, which is 150. So now to calculate the percentage increase, pretty simple. Just combine the two. So 150 over 90 minus 1, and we get 67%. So our answer is B. If the GDP deflator values from year 1 and year 3 were 190 and 212.8 respectively, which of the following best describes the annual growth rate of the overall price level? Which one of these? So here we have year 1, it's 190, year 2, we're not given, and then year 3 is 212.8. So there's actually 2 different periods. This kind of goes back to something I mentioned in some of the earlier learning modules where you could be given, a percentage increase, which is technically for this whole period, versus if you're given a value as of a certain point in time, you have to think about how many full year periods there are. So you have 1 going from year 1 to year 2, and then 2 going from year 2 to year 3. So to calculate the growth rate, we're going to need the compound growth rate, which is similar to the geometric mean return. And our formula ends up being 212.8 over 190. And we take the square root of this, which could also be known as to the power of 1 over 2. Some people might have messed up and done 1 over 3, and you would have gotten the incorrect answer. So 212.8 over 190 to the power of 1 over 2, which is the same as the square root, minus 1, and we get 5.8%. So our answer is A. Consider the following data for a hypothetical country. So we have some different accounts related to GDP and their amounts. Based on the data given, the GDP and national income are respectively closest to which ones? So start with GDP. We have this formula, which is very, very important, pretty likely to show up on exams. So GDP equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M. And this is consumption, this is investment, this is government spending, this is exports, this is imports. So it's adding net exports, that's how it's termed. So from this table, we can find all of this info. Consumption is 15. Investment, gross private domestic investment is 4. So we can cross these out actually as we go. We have government spending is 3.8. And then exports are 1.5 minus imports is 1.7. Note that when you're exporting more than you're importing, that's when GDP increases. If you're importing more, then you're spending more on foreign goods, so it's going to decrease your GDP. So if we run this calc out, we get 22.6, which is our GDP. So we could actually circle this now if we wanted to, but we'll also calculate national income. So national income is equal to GDP minus the capital consumption allowance, which is quite similar to depreciation. National income is basically saying the income that's derived from all the different values of production or factors of production that are used to create your output. So we have to subtract how much that value depreciated. This is kind of a similar term to depreciation. So we can take the 22.6 that we just calculated minus 1.5, and we get 21.1, which is the same in our answer here. Equality between aggregate expenditure and aggregate output implies that the government's fiscal deficit must equal what? So here, where we previously had the GDP formula, so GDP equals C plus I plus G plus net exports, we also have something slightly different, and this is used to model a different relationship between aggregate expenditure and aggregate output. You don't have to know how this formula is derived. Like the book basically just goes into some like substitution by assuming some of these inputs are equal to different things, and there's some algebra. You don't really need to know how it's derived. All you really need to know is what this formula implies. And what it implies is the following. On the left-hand side, we have government spending minus taxes, which is known as the fiscal balance. Because if you think of it, government spending is their cash outflow and taxes are the revenue. So the net is their fiscal balance. We also have private sector savings minus investment. And then here we have what we're familiar with already, net exports. So like I said, don't need to know how this formula is derived. All you really need to do is remember it, because a lot of questions in the curriculum will ask you, if the fiscal balance is this and the private sector is this, what does that imply for net exports? Like, will it be greater than or less than? Like a lot of questions will give you two of these inputs and ask you like what that implies for the next one. Or it might say, okay, an increase in the fiscal balance leads to what, et cetera, et cetera. So you just need to know basically the like how I like to think of it is the three different terms of the fiscal balance, private sector, and net exports, what those are composed of, and the relationship between them. So using this formula, we can go back into the question. We're saying that aggregate expenditure and aggregate output is equal. So it's basically saying both sides of this are equal. What does that imply for the fiscal deficit? Well, this is pretty easy, right? We already have the fiscal balance right here. So if everything's equal, then the fiscal deficit must be equal to, we have it already right here. We don't even have to rearrange. So savings minus investment minus net exports. Because of a sharp decline in real estate values, the household sector has increased the fraction of disposable income that it saves. So we're using the same kind of formula here. If output and investment spending remain unchanged, which of the following is most likely? So we have savings going up and everything else, like I said, is remaining unchanged. So how are we going to equate this equation again to make both sides equal? Well, we could either have the government balance increasing, or we could have this term decreasing. But note that we're subtracting net exports here, right? So it makes it a little bit different, where we would actually have to increase net exports and then it's subtracted. So it's an increase of the bracketed terms. So how do we make this equal? Well, we could have a decrease in the government deficit. Incorrect. We just said it could be an increase. We could have a decrease in net exports and increase capital inflow. No, like it's a bit tricky with the wording, right? So this entire term needs to decrease, but we're subtracting it, right? So net exports itself needs to increase in order for the subtraction to take effect. So the answer is going to be C. We need to increase net exports, which is then subtracted and then makes this side of the equation equal. Before we get into the next couple, I just wanted to bring up a quick graph here, which is the aggregate demand curve. So we have prices or price levels on the y-axis and income output, or you could think of this as GDP, so output along the x-axis. And the reason that this curve is downward sloping is due to three effects. The first being the wealth effect, which states that if prices increase, so let's say they go from P1 to P2, the output in an economy or the quantity demanded is going to decrease from Y1 to Y2 here. So all this is saying is that an increase in prices decreases output because people have less wealth to, let's do this, decrease in output Y. Because people have less wealth in order to consume goods. Then the interest rate effect is basically saying that an increase in interest rates will decrease output because there's less cheap capital out there in order to invest and expand. So an increase in our interest rates, once again, will decrease output. And then finally, we have exchange rates. So if exchange rates increase, so let's say I'm in the US and my US dollar increases, then what's going to happen to net exports? Well, if the USD appreciates, that's going to make imports cheaper for us and exports more expensive to the rest of the world. So exports are going to decrease and imports are going to increase. And remember that this term that we're always familiar with is net exports. So if exchange rates increase, then net exports is going to decline. So exchange rate, I'll use increase in X here, leads to a decrease in net exports, which decreases our output. Because you remember the formula that we've used a couple times now, where output or GDP is C plus I plus G plus X over M. So if this term decreases, then output is decreasing. So the way to kind of think about this is think about how an increase in either price, an increase in interest rates, or an increase in exchange rates always leads to a decrease in output. And then the vice versa is obviously true, right? So all of this is saying is due to the wealth effect, interest rate effect, and exchange rate effect, the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. So now going back to the questions, in explaining the downward slope of the aggregate demand curve, the interest rate effect suggests that a higher price will, well, the key thing here is that higher prices are going to lead to lower output, right? So you can almost skip the whole extra step about worrying about interest rates, so we can just look at the answer that has a lower level of consumption. So this is higher consumption, so that's incorrect. We also have higher consumption here. So the only one really is the lower consumption is B, which is just kind of what I talked about. So an increase in prices from P1 to P2 will decrease output. The extra step involved is that higher prices lead to more demand for money, which increases interest rates, and then higher interest rates lead to less spending and all that, which decreases output. That's kind of the extra step, but in this question is actually pretty easy because we know that an increase in prices will lower consumption. B was the only answer with lower consumption. So now going back to the questions, in explaining the downward slope of the aggregate demand curve, the interest rate effect suggests that a higher price will, well, the key thing here is that higher prices are going to lead to lower output, right? So you can almost skip the whole extra step about worrying about interest rates, so we can just look at the answer that has a lower level of consumption. So this is higher consumption, so that's incorrect. We also have higher consumption here. So the only one really is the lower consumption is B, which is just kind of what I talked about. So an increase in prices from P1 to P2 will decrease output. The extra step involved is that higher prices lead to more demand for money, which increases interest rates, and then higher interest rates lead to less spending and all that, which decreases output. That's kind of the extra step, but in this question is actually pretty easy because we know that an increase in prices will lower consumption. B was the only answer with lower consumption. One of the reasons the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping is because a lower price level means that the real exchange rate, once again, we can skip over the exchange rate stuff for now, and we can eliminate some answers by looking at a lower price level. Lower price level is going to increase output. And increasing output in this case is worried about net exports. So an increase in net exports will increase output. So we have higher level of net exports here, which is good. Higher level of net exports here, which is good. So it's going to be between one of these two. And this one says lower net exports, so that's incorrect. So now we can kind of connect the dots. Here we have two answers, like I said, with a higher level. So it's going to be one of these two. So we have a lower price level. And in order for net exports to increase, the domestic currency has to depreciate, right? Because like I said, if USD declines, then US exports will be cheaper to foreign countries and net exports will increase, and imports, if the USD declines, of course, will decrease because you're going to need, more USD to buy the same amount of goods as opposed to if it didn't depreciate, right? So we have currency depreciating, which is going to increase our net exports. Here, before we go into the next questions, just wanted to quickly explain this graph that you'll see. This graph is, pretty important in this module and in econ in general. It's used to drive a lot of theory. And basically what we have is we have a long run aggregate supply curve, a short run aggregate supply curve, and a aggregate demand curve. And all that this graph is saying is that at the point where these three lines intersect is known as full employment of an economy, and the point at the long run aggregate supply curve is the potential GDP of the economy in the long term. So we could have, some instances in the short term where, let's say, like aggregate supply was here and aggregate demand was here. We could be at a point here where we're below potential GDP and therefore below full employment. So this is actually, somewhat indicative of a recession versus if we had another point like over here that was beyond potential GDP. This is actually known as an expansionary environment. So the way I kind of like to think about it is, given that we have three different lines, you can kind of segment it into supply and demand. So on the demand side, anything related to an increase in GDP will shift or increase this aggregate demand curve. And just so we're clear, an increase is a shift upwards or to the right. That's kind of how I like to think about it. And a decrease would be a shift down here. So anything that increases GDP will increase the aggregate demand curve. So it could be like an increase in, monetary policy, an increase in wealth, anything like that. It could be a decrease in exchange rates, which will increase net exports. Anything like that will shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. And what happens here? So let's say we have this increase in aggregate demand, right? The new intersection in the short term, of course, because now we're not intersecting all three lines. The short run equilibrium would be somewhere over here where aggregate demand intersects with aggregate supply. And what this results in would be higher prices and higher output beyond potential GDP. And then if you wanted to get back into equilibrium, either, the long run aggregate supply curve would have to shift over here, or short run aggregate supply would have to decrease so that we're back at long run aggregate supply. But like key point here is to remember these three lines and how they look on a graph, and how if they shift, what does that imply for prices and output. So like on the other example, an increase in aggregate supply would be reflected like this, so shift to the right, which would lead to lower prices and higher output, right? So whenever a question asks about a shift in these and what it implies for prices or output, you can just draw this graph in equilibrium, then draw a shift, and then see where those lines now intersect in the short term. And that'll be your impact on prices and output. So continuing along, the supply is a little bit different because we actually have two separate lines. The short run aggregate supply is shifted by anything related to changes in outputs, or sorry, to any changes in their inputs. So it could be something like, increasing input prices would shift the aggregate supply curve to the left, or decrease it. Increase business taxes would also decrease supply, stuff like that. Whereas anything related to shifts in long run aggregate supply is related to fundamental changes to the economy's long-term resources. So it could be, an increase in the labor supply. It could be the country just found a bunch of natural resources, so they have an increase in natural resources. Or it could be an overall increase in productivity of your labor supply or inputs, which relates to an increase in long run supply. So productivity increases, of course, can happen in the short term. It's a long-term concept. So if you were to increase long run aggregate supply over here, this could be met with an increase in short run aggregate supply. And assuming aggregate demand stayed the same, we would actually get a higher level of output right here at lower prices. And given that all three lines intersect, we would also be at a higher level of full employment. Here we have two questions that are talking about the causes of those shifts that I just described. So the first one, the least likely cause of a decrease in aggregate demand. So it would be, once again, something like this. We have long run supply here, aggregate demand like this, aggregate supply like this. So this is LRAS, short run, aggregate supply here, and aggregate demand here. So a decrease in aggregate demand would be a shift to the left. Could be caused by higher taxes, so the least likely cause, a little bit tricky. Higher taxes, of course, higher taxes is always going to reduce demand, no matter where you are. Even higher taxes would decrease supply. A weak domestic currency, once again, so if your currency decreases, it's going to lead to an increase in exports because it's cheaper for other countries, and a decrease in imports because now it's more expensive. Foreign goods are more expensive for your country. So this would increase, if you look at the difference, it would increase net exports, which actually increases aggregate demand or GDP. So this is your answer. If you were to look at C, which is a fall in capacity utilization, basically what this is saying is that, if you have utilization of businesses at like 90%, here you're getting pretty close to the peak. So if this were to increase to like 99%, then you're going to need more property, plant, and equipment, or more investment to produce more goods. So if capacity utilization increased, this would lead to an increase in investment, which would increase output or GDP. So here we have a fall in utilization. So let's say we're going from 90% to like 80%. This would actually decrease investment. So given that we're saying what's least likely to cause a decrease in aggregate demand, this would lead to a decrease in aggregate demand. So this is not your answer. Continuing on to the next one, we have which of the following is most likely to cause the long run aggregate supply curve to shift to the left. So a decrease in long run aggregate supply. So, and what is most likely? So higher nominal wages, no, this is a short-term factor. A decline in productivity, yeah, that's exactly it. Because like I said, it's either productivity or a change in your overall resource base that is going to impact your long run supply. So this would be your answer. For C, an increase in corporate taxes. Once again, this is more of a short-term concept that has nothing to do with the resource base or productivity, so this is not your answer either. The most likely outcome when both aggregate supply and aggregate demand increase is a rise in inflation, higher employment, or an increase in nominal GDP. So whenever, once again, they ask these questions about shifts in aggregate supply and aggregate demand and the impact that that has on price levels and GDP, what I like to do is actually draw out the graph. So I have the standard one in equilibrium here, and then I can draw these shifts in aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So we can increase both of them. So this will be aggregate demand 1, and then we can increase aggregate supply as well, like right over here. I can call this aggregate supply 1. And our new equilibrium point is right over here. But this is a bit tricky because all it's saying is we have aggregate supply and aggregate demand increasing, but we don't know the magnitude of both increases, right? So let's say I kept aggregate supply here, the increase right here, and I increased aggregate demand by this much instead. This is aggregate demand 2. You can see here, at this point versus the point in like the yellowish, we have a price level that's higher versus this point, we have a price level that's lower, right? So coming back to our question, the most likely outcome, a rise in inflation could be true, but like we could also have a shift in aggregate demand and aggregate supply that like meets. So let's say that let's just draw one more here. So aggregate demand 3, aggregate demand 3, and then at this point we're actually at the same price level that we were at previously, right? So we don't really know what this does to the price level, so we can't really know what it does to inflation. For B, higher employment, this is actually the answer because we have, no matter the magnitude of these shifts, we always end up at a point further along on the output level, which remember the equilibrium is also representative of the employment level or full employment. So no matter if we're at this point, or this point, in each case, we're always at a higher employment level. If we're coming back to C, so this is going to be our answer, right? If we're coming back to C, an increase in nominal GDP is a little bit tricky. Once again, it depends on the price level. Like the way to think of it is that this is actually real GDP. So we have real GDP increasing, but depending on where these lines intersect and the price level, we don't really know the impact on nominal GDP without knowing the magnitude of these shifts. So all we know for sure is that employment is going to increase. It could be at like this price level, even a price level like all the way up here. We don't know without knowing the magnitude of the shift. So the most likely outcome is going to be the higher employment. Which of the following is least likely to be caused by a shift in aggregate demand? Stagflation, a recessionary gap, or an inflationary gap? Well, we can go one by one here. And we have to know what each of these are, right? So stagflation for A is higher prices at lower output or lower unemployment. So if I was to shift aggregate demand, we can do it on the graph here. Once again, whenever I get these questions, I either visualize or just draw out the shifts in these curves. And the key thing to remember is that output's on the x-axis and price on the y. So if I decrease aggregate demand like this, we're going to get a new equilibrium right here at lower prices versus this, lower prices and lower output. And then if I increase aggregate demand, we're going to get new equilibrium with higher prices and higher output. So stagflation, like I said, is an increase in prices at lower output. So that would be actually something like over here, right? Increase prices, lower output. So for this to happen, it's not possible with a shift in aggregate demand. It would actually have to be a shift in aggregate supply, which would meet aggregate demand somewhere here. And then in this case, we have higher prices at lower output. So the answer is going to be A. And if we wanted to, work through B and C as well, a recessionary gap is lower prices at lower output, which was this point that we had right here. And an inflationary gap is higher prices at higher output, which is this point over here. So both of these are caused by shifts in aggregate demand. Stagflation, which is higher prices at lower output, needs to be caused by a shift or a decrease in aggregate supply. Following a sharp increase in the price of energy, which is a decrease to aggregate supply or a shift to the left, the overall price level is most likely to rise in the short run, and then which one of these? So if we draw this out, this is a decrease in aggregate supply, and we have higher price levels here. So in the long run, without any change to aggregate demand or long run aggregate supply, what's going to happen is this curve is actually going to shift back to where it was, and we're going to end up at the same point. So that would infer that in the long run, prices will remain unchanged at the original spot. So for price levels to change indefinitely in the long run, we're going to need either a shift in LRAS or aggregate demand. So just looking at the answers here, we start from the bottom. The prices will rise in the short run and continue to rise until all prices have been increased by the same proportion. No, they're going to end up where they were. Like I said, we're going to end up right back here. For B, prices are going to rise in the short run, but remain unchanged in the long run unless money supply is increased. So if there's no money supply increase, this is actually a increase in aggregate demand because we have an increase in monetary policy, expansionary monetary policy, which will increase aggregate demand. So if we drew this out and we increase aggregate demand, it could be like somewhere here. So this would be aggregate demand increase in response to this aggregate supply decrease. We would get increased prices, right? So the question's worded a little bit weird, but basically, if you sift through it, the overall price level is most likely to rise in the short run, but remain unchanged unless aggregate demand is increased, which is true. Because if nothing else happens, the price levels are going to stay right here. An economic forecasting firm has estimated the following equation from historical data based on the neoclassical growth models. Is just, another theory, econ theory, or a model that's used to, in this case, show the relationship between potential GDP growth and other factors. And if we came down here into this formula, this is actually what the formula is from the book. We have potential GDP growth is equal to growth in total factor productivity, which is a measure of productivity of the workforce, and it's related to technology improvements. And this number actually can't be observed in practice. It's always estimated. So you have the growth in TFP plus the weight of labor in national income, or the proportion of labor in national income, times the growth in labor plus the same thing for capital, right? So the growth in capital times the weight of capital in national income. So this question is pretty easy if we know this formula. So the intercept of 1.5 is best described as the growth rate of total factor productivity. Convergence of incomes over time between emerging market countries and developed countries is most likely the result of which one of these? So the key differences between emerging or developing markets and developed is that developed countries are already assumed to have capital and labor. So they already have, their machine set up, they have the labor force, all of that. Whereas emerging markets do not have either of these. So their growth primarily comes from increases in capital and labor and kind of setting up the infrastructure that they need in order to grow. Whereas developed countries who already have all this stuff rely on growth in productivity. So that's the total factor productivity that we just mentioned. So they rely on increases in productivity, whether it's through technology advances or any sort of improvements along that nature to make their inputs more efficient. So coming back to this question, the convergence of incomes is most likely the result of, it's not total factor productivity because emerging markets don't have to worry about that yet. They worry about that once they become developed. Diminishing marginal productivity of capital. This is actually going to be true. So they're relating to the decrease in productivity or lower productivity in developed nations. So if they're getting diminishing marginal returns on their existing capital and the emerging markets are increasing their capital and labor, the gap between these two is gonna decrease. And in order for this gap to increase again, you're gonna need developed countries to increase their productivity. So the answer is B.